We're going to jump right into it. Thank you. I am Jenna Karadbil. I am an attorney. I've been practicing over 20 years in IP, tech, advertising, privacy, and entertainment. I'm located here in NYC. We also have on our panel Eliana Torres, who is an attorney in the IP group at Nixon Peabody, where she co-chairs the Metaverse in IP team. And we also have Timur, who is the CEO of Nebu, which is an NFT AI valuation engine. And so to tee it up really quick, what we're going to talk about today is a little bit about the current state of financing and valuation of NFTs. We're going to talk a little bit about IP. We're going to talk a little bit about where we see it going and perhaps why IP is important in that. So we're going to set the stage with Timur a little bit about financing and valuation.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Nice to be here. My name is Timur. I'm the CEO of Nebu, and as you mentioned, we're valuing NFTs through artificial intelligence. And in terms of where NFT finance is today, it's still in its very, very early stages. So what we see currently is that there are some financial derivative products out there, but the dominant financial product is really loans. And by loans, I mean, I have a PFP, I go up to a marketplace, I post my NFT up there and I want to get a loan against it, and then I'm waiting for someone to come along and offer me good terms for that PFP that I own. This is called peer-to-peer loans. And then there are these... That's
on a personal side, right? So I, as a consumer, own a PFP,
yes,
right?
exactly. And the majority of NFT products are purely consumer-focused. Also, I mean, peer-to-peer is where it started off originally. Now we have peer-to-pool, which is a bit more advanced version of that, where people start pooling their money together for a certain type of PFP. But the drawback there is that the majority of these pools and the marketplaces, they only support PFPs, and they also support the top 10 to 20 collections, which is, I mean, it's great if you have the capital to purchase a Bored Ape, but if you have a token which is in the top 30 or 40, you cannot really get a loan against that. And that's where I see where the NFT fi space is moving. So there are more and more projects now that are building, services which is similar to TradFi products, where you almost have a kind of automated underwriting of a loan. Unlocked is a really good example for that. They just raised not long ago. And that's where I see this whole consumer lending side going in the future. And in terms of where NFT fi is going to go, I think it's really important to zoom out a bit and try to understand where NFTs are going as a whole. And obviously, the secret is that it's not going to be PFPs that's going to be dominating the market in 5 to 10 years, but there are lots of other use cases that we see popping up on a daily basis. I mean, even here, there are lots of companies that are doing different kind of stuff for NFTs. And I mean, one kind of very clear and easy to understand use case is metaverse and gaming, right? That I own a game asset, I can rent it out, I can lend against it, I can potentially insure it. But what we're really bullish about is the longer play, which is where NFTs are going to be a form of standardized property record of all kind of assets that we can own.
Well, do you own it? I think that's the next question.
Yes.
And we're going to talk a little bit about IP, because I think where this comes into play later on, and first of all, this is not financial advice. I didn't wear my NFA t-shirt, I should have. But in terms of valuation right now, when you are valuing the PFPs, for example, you're not taking into consideration whether there's IP associated with it at all, right?
Yeah, not yet. So we have started off in the PFP space. The reason for that is simply because that's where we had lots of transaction volume and need for such kind of service, because obviously without accurate valuations, you cannot build effective financial services on top, and everything has been focused on the PFP space. Having said that, there are more and more products going into the metaverse side of things, and from there, now we actually closed a round, which with that the money will be invested into actually expanding into new blockchains and also to new asset classes, which is going to start covering, NFTs with utilities that have IP linked to it, and that's going to be really exciting, I think.
Well, now, Eliana, you want to give us a little bit of highlight on the types of IP that, let's talk about the consumer side first.
Yeah, so I guess I'll point out, because I was just reading a report about the statistics on how intangible assets in this space kind of grew. So from like 1995 to the present, the intangible asset market value increased from like 60% to like 80 to 90%. So basically, the companies that are being valuated based on the intangible assets, meaning copyrights, trademarks, and patents. So to give a little bit of the background, I'm sure most of us here are lawyers because they're interested in this topic. So you guys know what the copyright is and what the trademark is and patents. In the valuation side of things, the most important ones are patents. They're the most valuable ones, which is the utility that you give something, an asset, and then the trademarks. So for example, I think McDonald's, we all know McDonald's, they're most of the valuation will be surrounded around their IP. So the McDonald's logo and all the current marks that they have, and that will be like the majority of the portfolio and how they will get evaluated. And that comes really into play when it comes to the finance side, because I think that's going to be one of the key components in how you guys kind of assess on what the lending platform is going to be able to give users, and whether that's peer-to-peer or larger loans or pools of loans. I think the IP is going to be a high value, or one of the main points that is going to be considered in the evaluation component.
Well, and just to give you guys a little bit of an idea, IP just in the US, so we're just talking about the US market, IP in general is worth $6.6 trillion. That is more than the national GDP, nominal GDP, for any other country in the world. So this is a huge amount of money in this, which is why you can see valuing and financing is going to be a big up-and-coming part of this marketplace. I think we want to talk a little bit about the difference between the consumer side and the institutional side. And so first, as a consumer, I own an NFT, whether that be art, whether it be music, whether it be a PFP, anything like that, versus the institutional side where now I have a project. And not only am I putting out the NFT, but I have inherent, as Eliana was saying, I have the brand, I have perhaps my patents or patentable processes, and they're two different things. So I think that's something, Timur, you're looking at getting into.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are lots of industrial and enterprise use cases that we see popping up. And this is something we discussed earlier, that there's a pharma company which is now piloting a project to mint an NFT for every box of pill that they produce, so they can actually track their supply chain. Also in Africa, there's a town which is piloting a project with and how we're exactly going to value that, I'm not sure. I hope I will learn that from you guys today and in the future as well. And yeah, overall, very excited to see how that part of the market is going to grow and shape.
And I think the panel before the last one talked a little bit and touched about licenses, and I think that that's something that we've seen in the space in the last probably 8 months, is looking at, what do you get, in terms of the content. Is it a license? Is it ownership? Are you getting copyright? Are you just getting a property right to buy and sell it as you want? And I think that's something, Eliana, you want to talk a little bit about the different types of licensing structures?
Yeah, so we briefly touched on that on the last few panels, but the licensing structure is basically whether you get, as a consumer, when you purchase an NFT, whether you're getting an assignment, so you're getting full rights of that IP that is being granted to you through this token, whether you're getting a license, so basically whether that's an exclusive right to use certain rights that are given through use of these NFTs. So whether that's the exclusive right to create derivative works or to make copies to reproduce, to display, those are specifically they're supposed to be in the terms of use normally, but as the previous panels mentioned, it's kind of hard to give that notice to people. So, and I'm not gonna get into that because that kind of was expanded upon in the last panel. But you will get either a license or an assignment, and that could be broken down into even more kind of subsets of what that would look like. And it could even be a Creative Commons license where you could basically have like an equivalent of like being in the public domain, so anyone could technically use it. So the valuation is going to take into account all those components, and I think you guys are going to have a hard time to figure out how to evaluate whether that's going to be, how that's going to impact the pricing or anything that you lend, based on whether that consumers are getting an assignment, so full rights of the IP, or they're getting just licenses of that IP. So
I think also from the institutional side, though, because as a project, if you are licensing versus assigning versus CCOing, that's going to affect your valuation, because going in to raise money to get funding, that investors are going to look at what do you actually own, where is the value in your project, and IP is a huge part of that.
One thing that I find interesting is you guys have seen that a lot of the projects have traded hands. So like the Pudgy Penguins had transferred hands. And one thing that I find very interesting is how are they evaluating what the project as a whole. And I think that's questions that we all have, is how do you evaluate a project based on the IP that they hold? Because right now it's, the rights that they're granting holders, but also the IP that they hold within the expansion of that actual brand. So, and I don't mean to confuse anyone, but for example, Bored Apes, they have their own brand. They have a global portfolio of branding where they've expanded. They have a really pretty wide reach. But if they were to transfer hands, would that be taken into account? And how would they evaluate that IP that they've granted holders and the IP that they've held to themselves? So they've granted holders some, and we're not going to debate what Bored Apes kind of granted holders, but let's assume for all intents and purposes it's a non-exclusive license. But they have some trademarks that they have pretty much been policing pretty actively. So how would that project be evaluated if they were to transfer hands and be a different, or owned by a different company? So kind of how Elon bought Twitter and how that got evaluated, and they had two separate pricing and he offered lower. I think for NFT projects, that's a little bit more tricky, I would say, is the word for it.
Well, it can get even more confusing because, for example, if I have a license and I, for example, make a TV show that's now airing, but then I sell my NFT. The license goes with the NFT, presumably. That's a whole nother panel on whether that actually happens. But then who gets the royalties, and does the TV show have to stop? What happens? And so I think there's a lot of we deal in how many steps forward can we take strategically? And I think there's a lot to look into. And so as you're structuring, looking at these things from the beginning is actually really important. I know the contracts and things are very boring, but us we really like doing them. But I think if you look at it first and you structure it, then you perhaps have a better outset in terms of getting financing and getting investors involved.
I think a key takeaway from this is those projects that have actually traded hands, that have had quote unquote high valuation based on how much they've sold them for, have been very proactive at securing either trademarks or not copyrights, because then we go into the generative art kind of questions and AI and whether that's copyrightable. But for the majority of them, they have held most of their assets and their intangible assets in the trademarks. So the trademark filings that they have actually, or that they have secured, it's pretty impressive. So if you look at the top 20, I was just reading, I was doing my own research about top 20 brands of clothing and luxury industry, basically. So the top 20 brands of fashion, out of the top 20, 13 have already filed trademarks that include some level of Web3, NFTs, or metaverse. And that tells you something. They're being very proactive, and that's for existing brands. And I think that the ones that have traded hands, like Pudgy Penguins and some of the other ones that have actually passed from one owner to the other, have also been very proactive about that. So the proactivity, the offensive side as opposed to defensive, is, I think, one key takeaway from anyone who's either launching a project or interested in either purchasing an asset from that project. Are they actually policing their IP? Because IP is going to be what holds that project together. And I say that often because, for example, you have Toys R Us, and if you guys remember, Toys R Us went bankrupt, but the only thing that survived out of Toys R Us was the Toys R Us brand. And Toys R Us survived as a brand, and if you guys see them, they're already back in Macy's under a different owner. But that was one of the assets that actually was able to survive post-bankruptcy that was purchased. And that goes to say that, yes, we have a high regard for the copyright and everybody's up in arms about, do I get commercial rights? But the true value of it, in my opinion, and I'm sure I'm going to get flooded for this, but is the trademarks. Because that portfolio, that consumer recognition is what's actually going to take you to live longer than your actual existing present time. So Toys R Us has survived for a number of years, and if you guys haven't seen the Netflix documentary Toys R Us, or something along the lines of Toys R Us, that's the documentary. If you see all of the TNT, the Mutant Ninja Turtles, all that IP has survived past post years because they have been able to have those licensing agreements that are very protective of their brands, and most of them have been surrounded around those trademarks, not necessarily the copyrights. Although they do have some copyrights in the
Well,
turtles.
lot of I'm going to throw some out to the artists in the room, because a lot of the logos are in fact copyrighted. So a logo is one of the unique things that you can have both a copyright and a trademark on. And so I do think that there are both there, and I think the artwork. But I think getting back to sort of the financing and the valuation piece, I know you want to talk a little bit about the future. I think one of the things that we've seen pop up, for example, is the non-PFPs. A good example being music. Any of you in the U.S. know that Rihanna, one of Rihanna's producers, fractionalized his 1% interest in the master for one of her songs. It was about 300 NFTs that were sold, and they all started getting paid, allegedly, in February of this year, a percentage of what, her publishing rights. And so, that to me is sort of the future where we actually have, tangible royalties and things coming in. We're not relying on a OpenSea or any platform to have a royalty. These are actual tangible royalties. So talk a little bit about that maybe, Timur.
Oh yeah, that's as I mentioned. This is gonna be the challenge for us in the upcoming years, right? So we're currently valuing PFPs, and I have to say we're really accurate there. We have a 1 to 3% MP, which means that we actually backtest all our valuations.
And it's AI, right?
Yes, it's through AI, and then when we backtest it, we look at actual sales data, and we are usually off by this 1 to 3%, which is actually really good in the PFP landscape. And what we're doing there is, we're gathering all the data that is available off-chain, on-chain. We look at the transaction data, we look at token attributes, and literally everything that's out there. Then we do some feature engineering, our magic, and then we derive at a valuation for that specific asset. And I think when we are looking at the game assets, it's also quite simple in a sense that, if we think about a land in Sandbox, it's similar as actual real estate in the real world. You can get characteristics and understand what neighborhood that specific real estate is in. Is it a hot area or not so much? And through this kind of attributes, it's quite easy to derive to value. And I think in the future, when we're going to be looking into IP, trademark, and these kind of things, we will have to look at comparable industries. And perhaps that's a question back to you guys, is how do people value, in comparable industries, these kind of IPs and trademarks?
There's whole companies that do report. Yes. They make big money on it.
We hire companies that do the valuation for us. We just analyze the findings.
There's definitely a lot of it. But I think that's one of the things, though, is that this will expand because those companies right now are not touching the NFT space at all. And I think that's, maybe for those developers in the room, a space where we need to be able to start coming in and doing that. My own opinion, though.
One question for you, Timur, actually, that just popped out of my head is, what about rarity? Because that's something also very subjective. And how are PFPs being kind of evaluated based on the rarity?
Yeah, that's also one of the inputs that we look at. So if we go back a bit, how our valuation works, we use what we call explainable AI, which means that usually AI is a black box, right? So you take some data, you throw it into it, and there's an output at the other side, but you have no idea why that whatever is worth that much or how it derives to an actual answer. And with our algorithms, we actually have a separate algorithm for each collection that we support. So that's 50 million NFTs across 20,000 collections. We use this explainable AI to understand how actually we come to valuation, meaning if there's a sword which is worth 10 Ethereum, we say, okay, 6 Ethereum comes from the fact that it's a set of swords that is being traded a lot in the past few months. Then there is maybe 7 Ethereum because added to it because it's a very strong sword that decreases a lot of HP from other players. But then potentially there is 3 Ethereum deduction of that because it's a sword that has been nerfed just a week ago and because it was too strong. And then you actually understand, okay, the value derives from these things, and that's how our valuation becomes accountable, auditable, and really transparent, which is what we want to achieve.
So that's, I think, all we have time for. But we'll be around if there's any questions. But thank you guys for listening.